I'm Jess, and this is Seam Shift. So what is Seam Shift? It's about changing the language of painting from a flat image to an object. And the seams are where the painting shifts from surface to object. They're all created by cutting them up and sewing them back together. I become more interested in building something rather than just painting something. And I've always loved painting. I love color, and I think that's probably how I came into painting. But traditional painting keeps me really still, and I have a really hard time with stillness. So I'm somebody who likes to move. I was a runner all my life. I like climbing and hiking. And I generally feel more connected to the world through physical experiences. So I can't sit still and make a painting. I've always been interested in the physical act of making things and working with materials, which is why I love working with a raw canvas as opposed to primed canvas, because there's more flexibility in the material. And then that's also why I chose to do a lot of large scale work for this show, because I felt like I was like constructing something or building something. I come from generations of people who work with their hands, mechanics, welders, housekeepers. And my grandmother did a lot of sewing. She made a lot of quilts. She had 11 kids. She made all of their clothes. And I've also spent a lot of my life working in more physically, like physical labor. I've done a lot of physical labor. So for a long time, I think I felt like those jobs that I had were somehow separate from being an artist, or they were almost less valuable to society because they were just physical labor. So I think bringing those experiences that I've had within my life and in my family history, bringing that into my artwork has become really important to me. I feel like I discovered creativity through craft before I discovered fine art. I grew up in small towns. I didn't grow up around museums or contemporary art. So creativity entered my life through craft. It entered through sewing and making things and spending time outside. And art supplies often came from craft stores like Joann Fabrics, or even the grocery store, like in the office supply aisle. And I think because of that background, painting has always felt a little bit more precious to me. And that's not necessarily something that resonates with me. So craft feels a little bit more natural, like a natural way for me to create. All of this work was also influenced by the West Coast, mostly from Southern California and the Mojave Desert. Over the last few years, or a couple years, I traveled to LA and Joshua Tree a lot. And I went out there with the intentions of potentially buying land or building a house or remodeling an older home. So I think my mind became even more fascinated with the idea of construction and architecture, materials, repair, and thinking a lot about the way that people create homes, especially in like really harsh environments like the desert. So I spent a lot of time on Google Maps and Zillow and looking at like old houses and looking at the land structure and typography. And so I had like a lot of those images in my mind when I was creating this work. And I think that also being in the desert, like the sunsets out there are amazing. And I know that Colorado has amazing sunsets, but there's something about the desert. It's just like, it's so intense. So I think that a lot of my color palettes were really inspired by that. And I think that whole experience really just like quietly came into things that, like all of this work, all of the stuff that I was making. And it became less about the image and more about the form. Like before I started all the pieces for the show, I was doing a lot of sewing samples. And I knew that I wanted to like bring a new sewing technique into my work. I just really wasn't sure what that was yet. So yeah, I did a lot of small sewing studies, like there's a few here. And I think that I might have spent more time sewing than painting the last couple of years. So let's see, where am I at? And then I kept coming, like in the back of my mind, I kept coming to quilts. But for whatever reason, I was very resistant towards that. I don't know, it's almost like I've never made quilts and I've always identified as a painter. So I think I didn't want to identify as a quilter. And maybe that was just like my own thoughts around fine art and craft as well. Like I was growing out of that, but I was like really resisting it. And I also didn't want to be identified as a textile artist. I think sometimes in the art world, there's just different ideas about the things that we make and how valuable they are. And I just always identified as a painter. So anyways, eventually I found this book that had a lot of like quilt patterns in it. And I wasn't necessarily inspired by the quilts themselves, but more just like the design of the quilts. So it was like a lot of geometric patterns, and I love patterns. I love geometry. There's something that feels really calming to me about that. So once I saw that, I was like, okay, that's it. I'm just going to do it. And I felt really committed. I think that like sometimes the painting can be really chaotic. Like I'm painting with thinned out acrylic paint and I don't necessarily know what's going to happen to the paint, like how it's going to be mixed together. And so I don't have a lot of control around it. But when I bring it into the grid, it gives me that sense of control. So the grid was a good entry point because, I don't know, it just felt easy and I knew I wanted to make large scale and I knew I was going to make a lot of work and I didn't want to overcomplicate like all the designs. And then I knew I love color, so I wanted to be able to explore that still. And I felt like if I just stayed within the grid that there would still be structure, even though a lot of the paintings have different color palettes. It was also really interesting, like coming up with different designs within the grid. Like it's just squares and triangles, but I felt like you could still do so much with it. So when I make each piece, I decide what size like canvas frame I'm going to use. And then that determines how many paintings I'm going to make to fill that space. So each painting is about 1 to 3 paintings per piece. Like this one behind me, I think is maybe 3 paintings. When I'm painting each piece, I'm thinking about like how it's going to be cut up. Like I'm trying to create different marks and leave negative space in certain areas because I know that it's going to be cut up. And thinking about like how those shapes might interact with each other afterwards. I get really excited when I get to cut up the painting. Like when I finish a piece, when I finish the painting, it doesn't feel done to me. And I'm really excited to see like that transformation after I cut it up. And start putting the pieces back together. Like after I have all the triangles cut up, I cut up the blank pieces and then add those and then tape it all to the wall and rearrange it. And when I first started making them, I felt like, oh, this is gonna be easy. Like I'm just gonna crank these out. But once I got to the design part of it, it took a while. And there was a lot of, like, that's when the real creativity started happening. I would have it taped in the wall and like leave it for a few days and then walk away and move pieces around. And then at times I even would add like these brown pieces here. Those were just painted separately and then added later. So some of the paintings have like extra pieces that were added later as well. So then I sew it all together, try to keep everything in order, and then stretch it over the frame. So I feel like this work is really just connected to stories of working class people. I wanted to highlight labor and repair. I feel like a lot of my life experience, I've often been surrounded by people who use their hands to provide for their family. Mechanics and housekeepers and cooks and I feel like all those forms of labor really carry a lot of value and knowledge. I like to ask myself, like, within this body of work, or just in life in general, what do you see on the surface, but what lives beneath the surface as well? I wanted to end with showing you the back of this piece. So after, this was the first piece that I finished here, and I really fell in love with the backs of the pieces because you can see all of my marks and you can see like the imperfection. You can just really see where all the work was done. And I like the idea of like the back is imperfect so that the front can be perfect. For these pieces, I just cut them up. There might have been like a little bit of shifting here and there, but for the most part, I just cut it like in perfect squares. And then when I cut the triangle, like when I cut the square in half, there's definitely like do I want to cut it this way or do I want to cut it this way, right? Just depending on like what marks I want on each side. Yeah, and then it's interesting too because after I'm done designing the painting and then I sew it together, it gets smaller. Like I lose part of the painting. And yeah, so that can be tricky too, because sometimes there's some marks that I really want to keep in the frame, and I just can't. I'm losing them, or I have to make sure like the pieces that I'm putting in the middle of the painting, like I really want that to be seen. The only time that I take it apart is if like the stitching, like I messed up the stitching. But no, once I finish designing it, like that's it. Like it's done. Yeah, I don't change it at all. There was a part of the process where I'm like counting, like I'm separating them into individual piles. And I'm like, okay, I have 25 blank pieces and I have 40 green pieces because I'm trying to get like that balance. But I would say for the most part, it's pretty intuitive. I mean, there's definitely like maybe here, like this shape here, I knew that I wanted it to be next to a blank piece because I wanted it to create a whole new shape within that. So I'm thinking about that. But yeah, I would say it's mostly just a feeling and, you know, just thinking about things like balance. Yeah, I use lots of masking tape. Yeah. Yeah, so I'm just like taping it, moving it, turning it. I mean, I would say that happens after I sew it and I stretch it over the frame and like hang it and sit with it for a moment. Then I just don't know what it's going to be. You know, when I'm doing the painting part, it's so far away from what it's actually gonna end up like. I'm not gonna lie, I like a lot of them.
Yeah, sure.
Maybe that one. Yeah. That was the first one I did, actually. Yeah. And then that little tiny one in between here on the top, I just love that piece so much. I'm not sure why. I don't know. It's just so cute. So cute. Yeah, I think that I'm definitely going to do more of these, and I would also like to expand like the designs. So add some more like different shapes and like different types of quilting patterns. Yeah. Yeah, I think it would be fun to maybe like do the opposite and pick a certain color palette, but then do like a bunch of different designs. Like where all does it shift into different? Yeah, definitely when I cut it up. I have all these tiny little pieces of the painting. And then when I design it, it's also changing and I'm sitting with it. And then it changes again when I sew it because I'm losing part of the painting. Yeah, it changes so much. And then even after, like, because after I sew it, it's just a large piece of fabric essentially, right? And then when I stretch it over the frame, it tightens and it just becomes something else. So I felt like this piece should be a landscape just because of its size. And, you know, I mean, as an artist, you do think about it. Is someone going to buy it if it's this way? But I just couldn't get away from it. It had to be this way. So yeah, lots of turning and flipping and deciding at the last moment which way was the right way, like when I'm photographing them. Yeah. I think that with this work, I feel like I kind of want to branch out into different forms, but keep like the same aesthetic. I'm really interested in like coming off of the canvas, you know, into ceramics or something else, but still having that same aesthetic and the colors and the geometric shapes and forms and patterns. Thank you.